Okay, well, I'll start us off and I'll just say hello to everyone who's watching this video. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for asking the questions about dynamic workflows. This is the first of our Ask Me Anything series that we've got, and I picked dynamic workflows because I thought, okay, it's a topic I know a little bit about at least, but I still have my colleague Dan Minney here with me to help me out because Dan, I think you these are in your area of speciality, aren't they? Dynamic workflows.
Yeah, done a bit of work on the different articles on the community to do with dynamic workflows, and I know the FMEUC coming up. We have dynamic workflow training, so I'm going to be hosting that with a few different colleagues.
Fantastic.
So yeah, it's a good opportunity to learn more about dynamic workflows. We'll be going more in depth. I think it's around a 3-hour session, so lots of time for learning. Yeah.
Excellent. So yeah, if anyone's going to be at the conference in Seattle in May, as you can see in Dan's background, then yeah, please do sign up for that training. It should be fantastic. Yeah. Well, let's go through the questions that we've got on the community. I won't share my screen. We'll just sort of talk about them, and for now, the first question was about handling schemas has always been a challenge. From newer feature areas where we have the option to add schema attributes to features to readers where you don't have that necessarily have that option. So what's the best way to handle schema and get them back into the stream? I'm wondering what I think this is Clifford. So I'm wondering what he means by that. But so what do we think here, Dan?
Yeah, we can take this question a couple different ways, I think. So kind of from the high level, thinking about schemas and getting them back into the stream, maybe I'm thinking about getting that to the writer in order for that schema to be accepted. Yeah, for most cases with dynamic writers, you can just send that schema feature straight to the writer, as long as there's kind of a match there between your data and the schema. I always like to use the schema scanner transformer if I'm not sure if the schema is right, if it's been changed. And we have a few articles on the schema scanner, so for sure we'll provide links to some of those. But Mark, I don't know your thoughts on that one.
Yeah, the tutorial definitely has got some good ideas. I think the idea there is how do you get the schema to the writer and in what form? And I think there's two different ways. You can attach it onto each feature. So each feature carries its own schema. And I think you can just send a schema feature to the writer and it goes in the same input port and just recognizes, hey, this is a schema feature. This is where the schema is coming from. So that's really how we get the schema from reader to writer. Whether you've read it from the data set, whether you've used a schema scanner, I think it's all the same structure, isn't it?
Yeah, so there's the schema sources and schema definition name parameters on your writer. So those will define kind of where your schema is coming from. And then if you have changed your schema, or if you need to match up the name between your data and your schema, then you can use the schema definition name to specify an attribute there.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
And the other way we were looking at this question was about dynamically exposing attributes in the workspace. But if we still think that's what was being asked here, but
yeah, that question's come up quite a few times in the community. It's definitely a tricky one. I know there's some kind of workarounds there to get it working, and I've talked with the developers before because I've been curious myself. Can we expose the parameters dynamically? And I think the ground rule here is that if FME doesn't know about the parameters or the attributes at runtime, for example, in a dynamic workflow, it won't know until you click the run button. Then it can't, use those attributes and transformers downstream.
Yeah, you can't author anything if you can't see those attributes, and FME can't see them until runtime because, it doesn't know if the source is truly dynamic. It could be anything coming through, so it can't just show any attributes in the workspace, and you make use of them. Yeah. So
would be nice to have, but it's
it would,
a bit of a tricky scenario there.
So, okay, well, the next question was well, this is a very interesting one. Would like to update user parameters dynamically without opening up the workspace. In other words, not just setting the parameter dynamically, but
Mhm.
the definition of it. I think, like if you've got a choice attribute, choice parameter, and it's got 5 different choices, how do you save those? How do you change those choices dynamically? And I think we've got good news there. It's coming up in 2025.1, I think it is.
Yeah, that feature should be out in betas later this year. It might already be out in some of the betas for FME Flow.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what we've got here is just a screenshot of what it looks like in 2025 Flow. So anytime you create a web app in Flow, you can turn on this option that says enable dynamic forms. And then for each of the different parameters you've got, you can go into that and say, yeah, I want this one to be dynamic or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can choose where the dynamic definition comes from. In this case, I've just set it to workspace. What it is, it's you define the structure of the parameter in JSON, and you just have to specify where that JSON's coming from, whether it's coming from a workspace or from a fixed URL or from wherever.
Yeah.
So, and you can change the default values for parameters. You can change the options in a choice or list parameter, and I think it's really useful for when you chain different apps together.
Yeah.
You can have one app does something and then it writes the new parameters for the next app to use. So it's going to be very flexible, I think.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what users use it for. Yeah, even with the URL option there, you could have, a URL to click in another app that you're using, or web form of some sort, and then that kind of populates those parameters for the user and limits them to what choices they can have.
Yeah, I'm loving that one. And I think there was another one that you mentioned about. You mentioned to me earlier when we were chatting about, what do we call it? Not consolidated parameters, but
the compound conditional.
Compound, yes, that's it. So that was. Can you describe that quickly?
Yeah, so with our current user parameters, you can set up conditions, but you can only set up kind of individual conditions for user parameters. So you could say, if another user parameter is set to a certain value, then you want to expose these other user parameters for the author to select. So we're kind of just upgrading that, making it more customizable, so you can do compound conditions there as well. So that's going to come out to Form and Flow. I'm not sure which version that's set to be on, but it's definitely going to be coming out, I would say, within 2025.0 or .1. So definitely keep an eye out for that. That'll be really useful alongside Flow apps in particular.
Absolutely. And we should mention that the thing I was talking about earlier, the dynamic forms, that's definitely only FME Flow apps, because that really there's anywhere else that you would want to make use of it, or there's nothing obvious that seems to me anyway. So
yeah, I think most of the users are going to be doing Flow apps for those dynamic parameters. Even if you wanted to use it in, say, just a quick runs workspace option, I think it's better to have it in a Flow app anyway, so it's kind of saved.
Yeah. So I think it's going to be it's going to work well. Okay, next question. That was from Kim in New Zealand, I think. Combining a dynamic reader and writer with the FME DB operation attribute to update topographic layers, and couldn't get that combination to work. I did have a look through our developer database, and I couldn't see any known issues about that, why that shouldn't work. And I think, Dan, you said you found something in the workspace to fix.
Yeah, I took a look into the workspace, kind of just a hunch that I had when reading through the question, and it really comes down to the fact that when you're using the FME DB operation on your writer, you also need to be providing that attribute to the writer. So, that could come in the form of an attribute that's gone through a change detector or you've set the value yourself. But if you do, say, for example, in this workspace have an attribute, I think in this workspace it was called changes or change, you just need to rename it to fmedb operation. And that way if the writer knows to pick up that attribute, and that's where the feature operation is going to be coming from. That's just kind of how FME works and how the writer communicates with the rest of the workspace to figure out which function it's going to perform.
Do you have that on screen that you can share with us right now, or what you were looking at, or?
Yeah, let me just grab the workspace. Okay. Just move some screens around here.
I know that feeling. I've got so many tabs and screens open. I should mention as well to anyone watching that this is the first time I've recorded a meeting live like this, so I'm not sure what we're getting out of this right now, but hopefully it's me and Dan next to each other, and
and the screen share, hopefully.
And the screen share now as well.
Yeah. So yeah, just the difference here is that we've got this attribute called _change_, and that kind of dictates which operation we want to perform in the writer. So right now we've got it set to, we have individual writers for each of these different operations. There's nothing wrong with that. That's, another good way to manage your workspace. For some users, they might prefer to be able to see what's exactly happening in their workspace. So, having 3 different writer feature types is definitely okay. You don't need to necessarily change your workspace. But if you did want to use the fmedb operation, which we have set up here, then what you can do is you just need to make sure that you're renaming that attribute. And that's pretty much all you need to do. So if you don't have an attribute called fmedb operation that's defined, then the writer is not going to know which attribute to use to perform those changes.
So it might be as simple as that.
Yeah.
Possibly.
Yeah.
The other thing I noticed in this workspace, if you can open up one of the dynamic writer parameters, was the schema source was also set to CSV in there as well, and I wondered if it was getting confused with some of the CSV files. So I would have turned that, like you did. I would turn that off just to make sure it's not getting confused. Because we're reading from CSV, you're writing to the geodatabase, and you've got the schema source set to the geodatabase. It doesn't need to be the CSV.
Yeah, and something handy here is that this is the schema source is coming from a reader resource. So kind of what that is it's essentially like you're pulling in your schema from a data set without actually pulling a reader into the workspace, so you don't have to read all those features. So that's what they've done here in this workspace, which is really useful if you want to pull that schema from, if you're writing out to a geodatabase and and you have a schema already set, but you're running the workspace dynamically, then you can run it that way. So you're setting the schema, but it's also still a dynamic workflow. Yeah.
And you could read it with a proper reader and just get the schema out of that, but this is specifically designed to just read the schema or read it, exactly, without actually having to have an object on the canvas.
Yeah.
So that's good stuff. Okay, well, I hope that answered that question. Jacques asked, what's the most misunderstood concept regarding dynamic workflows? And we were chatting about this earlier, and I wondered if it was I think we both thought it might be the sort of the whole concept of schema as a separate object in itself, in its own right. Like separating data from schema, and the fact that now we can pass schema through a workspace as its own feature. That confused me a little bit when we first did it. I'm like, well, okay, I just feed it into a writer and that recognizes it. Well, yes, basically. So
yeah, it can be confusing at first when you're kind of configuring dynamic workflows, because the schemas are kind of like a hidden object within FME. I think the easiest way to understand it is if you were to use a feature reader instead of just a normal reader, because that's going to output a schema feature. So then you can actually click through that and see what your schema looks like. Whereas if you're just configuring a regular reader, that schema is still going to exist alongside your data, but it's going to be a little less visible to the user. So definitely recommend using the feature reader if that's something you're comfortable with. Yeah, it kind of just has the added functionality there of being able to see your schema. So I really like that portion of it.
Yeah. To be honest, we should be using feature readers all the time and not readers, I think now. It's got to that point where that's pretty much the default technology. It's just old timers like me that still use readers, but it's a habit to try and get out of. But,
yeah, good for a quick workspace.
It is.
But yeah, it's nice having the add functionality of a feature reader. So I'm just going to pull up a screen share real quick just to show that off.
Yeah.
Thought it might be useful.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's just share the screen again. Yeah, so if you've got your feature reader here, I've read in 2 different tables. So we got community centers and drinking fountains. So within these in your visual preview window, you've got all your values and your attributes. But if you want to look at your schema itself, or if you want to edit the schema, then you've also got that schema output port here. And a couple of important things here. You have FME feature type name. So that kind of tells us which features the schema corresponds to, or which data set. And then if I open up our feature information window here, this is where you can actually see your schema. So you can see the name of the column or the attribute, and then you can see the FME data type that FME's assigned it, and then you can see the native data type that's coming from the source itself, in this case, geodatabase.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things as well that can be a little bit confusing is that FME feature type name, and the fact that when you get to the writer, you have to basically match each feature with a corresponding feature type name schema. Yeah. And that schema can come from anywhere. So it could come from the reader like this. It could come from a resource reader like in that last workspace. You could make one up yourself if you wanted to generate all these attributes manually. It could be a schema scanner. It could come from there instead.
Yeah, yeah.
And you could give it a different name as well. If you want a different name on the output, then you basically give your features a new, with the fan out, you would give them a different value. But that value would actually have to match to a known schema via that feature type name.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just something to be careful of. You want to make sure that the FME feature type name here just matches up to the data set that you're writing out.
Yeah. I think that's the error I get the most when I'm doing the schema. Well, in fact, I'm not even sure it's an error. You just write your data, and then at the bottom of somewhere in the log, it says could not find a matching in the schema, and that'll
be the first place to look.
Yes. And the name's different, and so I'm not sure it is an error. It's just sort of a warning, and so you just drop data and you don't realize it's not there, and that'd be why. Okay, well let's have a look at the next question quickly from take_VF. I currently have a workflow where I write a series of staging tables in SDE geodatabase and then production tables in the same database. So each table staging and the output is identical in the schema. It's just that they've got different prefixes. So I assume it's like staging _ my data and live _ my data. So the idea is they would like to read features from those tables, do a change detection, and send the edits to the writer using the FMEDB operation. So all of the other attributes and geometry need to be checked against each other. And we were wondering about that because when you do a change detection, can you do it dynamically on any attributes that are in there?
Yeah, somewhat. You can set it to match for all attributes. You can also set it to match for all except a few attributes. So you could exclude some like object ID, global ID, or job ID. So there are options there to still use it in a dynamic workflow, but it can be can trip some users up. So just something to be careful of.
It goes back to that what we were saying earlier, that if you've got all these tables with different attributes in, how are you going to pick which ones you want in the change detector if you don't know in advance which table might be selected? So you're going to have to check all of them or none of them, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
But is this still a good use of dynamic workflows? Is the question.
Yeah, I think if you have a lot of tables with a lot of different schemas, then it's worth considering a dynamic workflow for this sort of workspace. Yeah, it just really depends on what you're comfortable with as well. It can save a lot of time for sure, especially if you're running these processes and those table names are changing all the time. But if you have pretty static table names and this is a workspace that you're running maybe just once, then it could be worth considering just sticking with a static workspace.
Okay.
But again, it's up to the user. There's preferences there. There's obviously more than we know about the workspaces and the workflows. So, but everything in this workspace should be possible.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't see any problems with it and using the change detector. Just something to be careful there with the matching of the attributes.
Yeah, I guess definitely there's that idea of, well, you don't need to use dynamic all of the time sometimes, because there's definitely an overhead to setting it up dynamically. It's adds a bit more, it adds an extra layer of complexity to things. And if you can do things without being dynamic and it's not really much of an overhead, you don't have to be doing many changes, well, then that sounds like the way that you I want to do it.
Yeah.
But otherwise, that should be fairly straightforward to be a dynamic reader. Really, it's just sort of reading all of the tables at once, or letting you pick which table to read, and then the writer just should write whatever schema is coming from the reader. So yeah, pretty straightforward.
Yeah, and at the end of the question here, they mentioned they like to choose the object type that they're going to update at runtime. So for that, I would just use a user parameter. If you want to, the object that's specifying the table name that they want to update. You can even populate a list of choices. So when you run it at runtime, you can change which tables you want to update or which ones you want to read. Then that's another possibility there.
Yeah. Sounds good.
Awesome.
Shall we
One
look
last question?
Yeah, the last one from Karen. I wonder if it's possible to create a dynamic Excel reader and extract the attributes. It's a very short question. I think when it's short, there's we could spend hours talking about that. But I mean, yeah, you can create a dynamic Excel reader.
Yeah.
Depends what you mean by extract the attributes, I guess, is what it comes down to. Do you mean extract the schema of the attributes? Which, yeah, we can do with the feature reader can do that. The schema scanner can do that. If you just want to know the schema of your data, then you can do that. Extract the attributes. Again, yeah, we can read them. We can read the attribute dynamically. But again, going back to the idea of, well, you can't necessarily expose them in the workspace and change them and manipulate them if you don't know in advance what they're going to be.
Yeah.
Some transformers do have that option that says, oh yeah, just anything that comes through, carry out an operation on it. But most of the transformers will make you pick the name of the attribute to process. So you're going to be a bit stuck on those.
Yeah, one thing that can be tricky with the dynamic Excel workflows is if you're reading multiple files. So I know there's an additional parameter you need to specify when you're adding in your dynamic reader to make sure that it reads all the sheets from all your different data sets. So I have written an article about this. I think if that's something that you're running into issues with, then definitely take a look at that article. And that'll be kind of the easiest way to solve that. I don't want to go too in depth into it during the AMA right here, but yeah, just be careful about the When you're reading in Excel, it's going to be kind of reading in per sheet. And then if you do have multiple data sets, then it's worth considering using the feature writer, because then you'll have more control over, if you want to write out back to multiple files with multiple sheets within each file, then the feature reader is really solid for that, because you can control not only the sheets that you're writing out, but also which data set those sheets are going into.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just going to share my window for a second just to show this tutorial that we do have on knowledge base, support center we call it now. So there's a whole series of dynamic workflow tutorial, and there are a whole bunch of things that you can look at in here. You can see all the different articles. We've tried to come up with all of the different scenarios that you might come up against. So destination schema is derived from a schema feature. Destination schema is derived from multiple sources. So you're basically reading two schemas from different data sets and merging them together and creating a new output schema. There's lookup tables. There's all sorts of things. Goes from very straightforward to more complex.
Yeah.
Modifying the schema features. That one looks like an interesting topic to look at. Dealing with schema drift as well. How that's like change detection. How do you know if the schema has changed from what it used to be, and how can we update the output schema to match what it should be now rather than what it was earlier? And there was a whole webinar about that idea.
Yeah.
So,
we've done some webinars in the past recently as well. Some good examples in there, so
yeah,
sure, check those out if you haven't yet.
So yeah, support center, support.safe.com. Go and look at that and find these tutorials. That'll cover a lot of things. And obviously, about the community because that's where we got your questions from. So, but yeah, feel free to ask any follow-up questions on there, and somebody will be able to out, I'm sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
The conference coming up, like we said earlier, Dan's running the dynamic workflows training, so that'll be fantastic, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So get along to that, and
come by and check it out. We've also got multiple other training courses, so if that's not your cup of tea, there's quite a few other ones there.
Yeah, and also, I mean, there's the support experts are going to be there. There's, I don't know what they call their little area of the conference, but they'll be there. They'll be able to answer your questions.
Yeah, I think it was called Basecamp at the previous one back in 2022, I think.
Yeah, we used to call it doctor's office at one point, and then then you're right, Basecamp, and then who knows? It could be something different this time, but they'll be there. They'll be able to answer questions and show things like dynamic workflows. So yeah. Okay, well, yeah, I hope that was useful. I hope we answered the questions right. Look out for another Ask Me Anything. And probably we'll do one every month. And I don't know what the subject's going to be next time, but we'll try and pick an interesting one. And again, thank you, Dan, for being here today and for being so great at answering all these questions. It's
some really great questions came through.
Excellent.
Yeah. Hopefully we provided some clarity, and for sure drop any more comments in there if you have some follow-ups to what we've mentioned today.
Yeah,
I'll keep an eye out.
Excellent. So thanks, folks. Yeah, bye.
Thanks.